The icy wind swept down from the mountains like death's own breath, cutting through Abigail Cassidy's threadbare shawl as she huddled against the base of a pine tree, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. 2 days had passed since her husband Thomas had driven their wagon up into these New Mexico mountains, promising to return with firewood, then disappeared into the wilderness with all their supplies, leaving behind only bitter words about not wanting a child to burden his dreams of striking it rich in the silver mines of the West. "We'll survive," she whispered to her unborn child as the first snowflakes began to fall across the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the autumn of 1875. "Somehow, we'll survive this." 23-year-old Abigail had been married for barely a year when they'd left Missouri, Thomas claiming to have a sure plan for their future in the New Mexico territory. His handsome face and smooth promises had made her believe they would build a good life together. Now, 7 months pregnant and abandoned in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back, those promises lay as barren as the rocky ground beneath her. The snow fell harder as darkness approached. Abigail knew she couldn't survive a night exposed on the mountainside. With effort, she pushed herself to her feet, leaning against the trunk for support as a contraction gripped her. Not labor, she prayed, just the stress and cold. Too early, too dangerous. When it passed, she began moving downhill, following what looked like a game trail through the pines, hoping it would lead to water, shelter, or merciful God willing, people. Miles away, Gabriel Jennings led his horse through the same mountains, tracking a wounded elk through the gathering storm. At 31, Gabe had learned to read the wilderness like most men read books. 10 years of ranging between civilization and the untamed backcountry had taught him when to push forward and when to turn back. Today, the rapidly deteriorating weather told him it was time to abandon his hunt and return to the small cabin he maintained on the eastern slope. His weathered face, framed by a dark beard flecked with premature gray, creased with concern as he studied the darkening sky. This early-season storm would be brutal. He whistled softly to Brutus, his dun gelding, and turned back toward home. "Come on, old friend. Let's get ahead of this before it gets mean." He'd gone less than a mile when Brutus suddenly lifted his head, ears pricking forward. Gabe paused, one hand resting on his Remington. In these mountains, unexpected encounters rarely brought good news. Then he heard a faint cry carried on the wind, so weak he almost thought he'd imagined it. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing against the rocks. Nothing answered but the wind, but something told him to investigate. He looped Brutus's reins around a branch and moved cautiously toward the sound, his boots crunching on the fresh snow. As he rounded a cluster of boulders, he saw a flash of dark fabric against the white ground. Abigail had fallen. The dizziness had overwhelmed her suddenly, black spots dancing before her eyes until her legs simply gave way. The cold seeped through her dress into her bones as she tried to rise, but her body refused to cooperate. She thought she heard a voice calling, but it seemed so distant, dreamlike. Then a shadow fell across her face. "Madam, my God, what are you doing out here alone?" Abigail blinked up at the tall figure silhouetted against the gray sky. A man's face came into focus, concerned eyes beneath the brim of a worn hat. "Help," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Please." Gabe knelt beside her, taking in her condition with a quick glance. The pregnancy advanced enough to be unmistakable, her lips tinged blue with cold, the absence of any supplies or proper winter clothing. He slipped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Where's your husband?" he asked as he helped her into a sitting position. A tear slipped down her cheek. "Gone. Left me here." The simple words carried such weight that Gabe felt a flash of anger toward a man he'd never met. He'd seen his share of cruelty in the West, but abandoning a pregnant woman in the mountains ranked among the worst. "My cabin's about 3 miles from here," he said, his voice gentle despite the harshness of the situation. "Can you ride?" When she nodded weakly, he helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight. Another contraction seized her and she gasped, doubling over. "The baby," she started. "How far along?" 7 months, she managed through clenched teeth. Gabe's worry deepened. He'd helped deliver foals and calves, but never a human child, especially not one coming too early. They needed to get to shelter and fast. "What's your name, madam?" "Abigail. Abigail Cassidy." "I'm Gabriel Jennings. Gabe." He guided her carefully back to where Brutus waited. "We need to move quickly. That storm's coming in hard." By the time he'd lifted her onto Brutus's back and mounted behind her, the snow was falling in earnest. Gabe wrapped one arm securely around Abigail to steady her, feeling her shivering against his chest despite the heavy coat. She felt fragile, like a bird with a broken wing, yet he sensed a core of strength in the way she straightened her back and fought to stay conscious. "Just lean back against me," he instructed. "I won't let you fall." The journey to Gabe's cabin seemed endless. The wind howled between the trees, driving the snow sideways into their faces. Abigail drifted in and out of awareness, the motion of the horse occasionally triggering contractions that made her gasp and clutch at Gabe's arm. He talked continuously, partly to keep her conscious and partly to reassure himself that they would make it. "Cabin's not much, but it's solid. Built it myself 5 years ago. Got a good wood stove that'll warm you up quick. And there's a creek nearby with the cleanest water you'll ever taste." When the small log structure finally appeared through the curtain of snow, Gabe felt Abigail sag with relief against him. The cabin sat nestled among a stand of pines, its stone chimney jutting up from a cedar-shake roof, a small corral and lean-to stable off to one side. It wasn't grand, but it had weathered many storms and would shelter them through this one. Gabe dismounted quickly and lifted Abigail down, practically carrying her the last few steps to the door. Inside, the cabin was cold and dark, but mercifully dry. He settled her on his narrow bed, then moved with practiced efficiency to light the lanterns and stoke a fire in the iron wood stove. Within minutes, the first waves of heat began to push back the chill. "There now," he said, turning to find Abigail watching him with exhausted eyes. "Let's get you properly warm." He brought her the last cup of coffee from his morning pot, reheated on the stove. It wasn't fresh, but it was hot and sweet with the sugar he'd added. While she sipped it, Gabe assessed their situation. The storm would likely last for days. His supplies were adequate for one person, but would need to stretch for 2 now, one of them pregnant and potentially going into labor. "I don't mean to be a burden," Abigail said softly, reading his expression. "Once the storm passes, you're no burden," Gabe interrupted firmly. "And you're staying put until you and that baby are ready to travel safely. That's not negotiable." Something in his tone, not harsh, but resolute, made Abigail nod in acceptance. The warmth from the stove and coffee was beginning to thaw her, bringing with it an awareness of just how close to death she had come. Another contraction rippled through her, milder than before but still concerning. "Have they been regular?" Gabe asked, noticing her discomfort. "No. They come and go. I think it's just the cold and everything." Gabe nodded, though he remained worried. "I'll fix us something to eat, then you should rest. Tomorrow I'll see about making things more comfortable for you." As he moved about the small cabin, Abigail took in her surroundings. The single room was simply furnished but meticulously organized. A wooden table with 2 chairs stood near the stove. Shelves lined one wall, holding tins of food, cooking implements, and a few books. The bed she occupied was tucked in the corner, with a trunk at its foot. A rocking chair faced the small window. Everything spoke of a solitary but orderly existence. "Have you lived alone out here long?" she asked as Gabe placed a steaming bowl of rabbit stew before her. "Long enough to prefer it to most company," he answered, then softened the words with a slight smile. "Though I make exceptions for pregnant ladies lost in snowstorms." That drew a small laugh from Abigail, the first in what felt like months. "Lucky for me." They ate in companionable silence, the howl of the wind outside making the cabin's warmth feel all the more precious. After dinner, Gabe insisted Abigail take the bed while he made a pallet for himself near the stove. "I can't take your bed," she protested. "You're not taking it." "I'm lending it to you and my future neighbor there," he said, nodding toward her belly. "Call it Western hospitality." Too exhausted to argue further, Abigail accepted his kindness. As she drifted toward sleep, she heard Gabe moving quietly around the cabin, adding wood to the stove, checking the windows against the storm. For the first time since Thomas had abandoned her, she felt safe. The next morning, Abigail woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's small window, revealing that the storm had passed during the night, leaving a transformed world of pristine white outside. Gabe stood at the stove, his back to her. "Good morning," she said, pushing herself up to sitting. He turned, a genuine smile warming his usually serious face. "Good morning. How are you feeling?" "Better. Still some pain, but I think the baby has settled." "Good. That's good." He brought her a cup of coffee and a plate of food. "The storm's blown over, but it's left nearly 2 feet of snow. We're not going anywhere for a few days." Abigail nodded, accepting this reality. "I'm sorry to impose on you like this." Gabe sat in the chair beside the bed. "Stop apologizing. You didn't choose to be abandoned in the mountains." His voice hardened slightly. "Your husband, Thomas," she supplied. "Thomas," he repeated, the name sounding like an accusation on his lips. "He left you deliberately?" Abigail stared into her coffee, the memories painful to revisit. "We'd been arguing for weeks, about the baby, about money. He wanted to head to the silver mines down south, said a baby would hold him back." She swallowed hard. "2 days ago, he drove our wagon up into the hills to gather wood, said he'd be back by nightfall. He took everything, our supplies, money, even my coat. I waited a full day before I realized he wasn't coming back." Gabe's jaw tightened visibly. "Some men don't deserve the title," he said after a moment. "But you're safe now, and that's what matters." After breakfast, despite Abigail's insistence that she could help around the cabin, Gabe ordered her to rest while he went outside. From the window, she watched as he made his way through the deep snow to the lean-to stable where Brutus stood, then disappeared into the trees with an axe over his shoulder. He returned hours later, dragging pine logs behind him. Over the next 2 days, as Abigail regained her strength, she observed from the doorway as Gabe worked tirelessly, constructing what appeared to be an addition to the cabin. When she asked what he was building, he simply said, "You'll need a proper place soon enough." On the 3rd day, as Abigail sat in the rocking chair by the window, mending one of Gabe's shirts, another contraction seized her stronger than before, sending the needle and thread tumbling from her fingers. Gabe was at her side instantly, his face lined with concern. "That's the 3rd one in an hour," he said, his voice steady despite his worry. "I think we should prepare for the possibility that the baby might come early." Fear clutched at Abigail's heart. "It's too soon, and we have nothing for a baby here." "We'll manage," Gabe assured her, though his expression betrayed his own uncertainty. "I've delivered plenty of animals. Can't be that different." Despite his attempt at humor, they both knew the danger. A baby born this early in these conditions faced terrible odds. Throughout that day, Gabe worked with renewed urgency on his building project while keeping a close eye on Abigail. By evening, the contractions had subsided again, bringing tentative relief. That night, as they sat before the fire, Abigail found herself sharing more of her story, how she'd grown up in a small Missouri town, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had died when she was 16, leaving her to make her own way in the world. "I was working as a seamstress when I met Thomas. He talked so beautifully about the life we'd build in the West." She shook her head at her own naivety. "I wanted so badly to believe him." Gabe listened without judgment, occasionally adding wood to the fire. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "My father was like that," he finally said. "All big talk and promises with nothing behind them. Left my mother with 4 kids and a failing farm when I was 12. He looked into the flames. "That's when I learned that words are cheap. It's actions that show a man's true character." "Is that why you live alone out here?" Abigail asked softly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Partly, and partly because most people ask too many questions." This drew a laugh from Abigail, breaking the somber mood. When she winced at another twinge in her abdomen, Gabe's expression grew serious again. "You should rest. Tomorrow I'll finish what I've been building. You'll see then." The next morning dawned clear and cold. After breakfast, Gabe helped Abigail bundle up in a coat he'd fashioned from a spare blanket and led her outside. The snow had compacted somewhat, making it easier to walk, though he kept a supportive arm around her waist. Around the side of the cabin, Abigail stopped in surprise. What had been the beginnings of a rough structure 3 days ago had transformed into a small, adjoining room. Built of fresh-cut pine logs and sealed with mud and moss, it connected to the main cabin through a doorway Gabe had cut in the wall. Inside was a new bed frame, wider than Gabe's and filled with a mattress of fresh pine boughs covered with blankets. "It's not fancy," Gabe said, watching her reaction, "but it'll give you and the little one some privacy. The chimney extends through, so it'll stay warm." Abigail turned to him, tears welling in her eyes. No one had ever built something for her before, certainly not with such care and consideration. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." Gabe looked away, seemingly embarrassed by her emotion. "It's just practical," he muttered. Cabin was too small for 3. But they both knew it was more than that. In the week since he'd found her half frozen in the snow, something had shifted between them, a connection forming that neither had expected or sought. That afternoon, as Abigail arranged her few possessions in the new room, a sharp pain doubled her over, different from the earlier contractions, more intense and persistent. She called out for Gabe, fear evident in her voice. He found her leaning against the wall, her face pale. "What's wrong?" "The baby," she gasped. "Something's not right." Without hesitation, Gabe scooped her up and carried her to the new bed. With a calmness that belied his inner turmoil, he helped her lie down and assess the situation. "Tell me what you're feeling," he instructed. Between pains, Abigail described symptoms that confirmed his fears. She was in labor, 2 months too early. "I need to ride for help," he said, already calculating the distance to the nearest town. "There's a doctor in Truth or Consequences, but it's a half-day's ride in good conditions." Abigail clutched his hand. "There's no time," she said, another contraction racking her body. "This baby is coming now." The reality of their situation hit Gabe like a physical blow. He was about to become responsible for not 1 life but 2, with only his limited knowledge to guide him. Yet looking into Abigail's frightened but trusting eyes, he knew he had no choice but to try. "All right," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Then we do this together. The hours that followed tested them both to their limits. Gabe boiled water, gathered clean cloths, and positioned Abigail as comfortably as possible. Between contractions, he spoke encouragingly, telling stories of his travels to distract her from the pain. As labor progressed, he found himself praying for the first time in years, silent pleas for guidance and protection. "I can't," Abigail cried as a particularly vicious contraction tore through her. "I can't do this." Gabe took her hand firmly in his. "Yes, you can. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Abigail Cassidy. You survived being abandoned in a snowstorm. You can bring this child into the world." Something in his unwavering confidence gave her renewed strength. With Gabe's steady support, Abigail pushed through the pain, fighting for her baby's life with every ounce of determination she possessed. As night fell, the cabin illuminated only by lantern light, Abigail gave a final, tremendous push, and a tiny cry filled the room. Gabe's hands trembled as he caught the impossibly small infant, a boy, red-faced and angry at his abrupt entry into the world but alive. "You have a son," he announced, his voice thick with emotion as he wrapped the newborn in a clean shirt. "A fighter, just like his mother." When he placed the baby in Abigail's arms, the look of wonder on her exhausted face stirred something deep in Gabe's heart, something he had long thought buried beneath years of solitude and self-sufficiency. "He's so small," Abigail whispered, touching the infant's cheek with a gentle finger. "But strong," Gabe assured her, though worry creased his brow. The baby was indeed tiny, born well before his time. Without proper care, his chances were uncertain at best. Over the next days, they maintained a constant vigil over the newborn, whom Abigail named Samuel after her father. Gabe fashioned a cradle from a wooden crate, lining it with soft rabbit furs. When Samuel struggled to nurse, Gabe remembered a technique he'd seen used with orphaned lambs, showing Abigail how to express milk and feed the baby with a cloth dipped in the life-giving liquid. Each night, Gabe slept in a chair beside Abigail's bed, waking at the slightest sound from either mother or child. During the day, he hunted to provide nourishing meat for Abigail, gathered herbs he knew might help her recover her strength, and continued to improve their shelter against the deepening winter. 2 weeks after Samuel's birth, a rare warm day allowed Gabe to take Abigail and the baby outside for fresh air. Sitting on a bench he'd built beside the cabin door, Abigail breathed deeply, color returning to her cheeks as she enjoyed the sunshine. "I've been thinking," she said as Gabe chopped wood nearby. "Once the spring comes, we'll need to discuss what happens next." Gabe's axe paused mid-swing. The thought of Abigail and Samuel leaving had been hovering at the edges of his mind, unwelcome but inevitable. They weren't his family, after all, no matter how natural it had begun to feel having them in his home, in his life. "Of course," he said, resuming his chopping with unnecessary force. "You'll want to return to civilization." Abigail studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. "Actually, I was thinking we might stay, if that's something you'd consider." The axe embedded itself in the chopping block as Gabe turned to face her, surprise evident in his expression. "Stay here, Samuel and I have nowhere else to go," she explained. "And you," she hesitated. "You've become important to us." Gabe moved slowly to sit beside her on the bench, careful not to disturb the sleeping infant. "Abigail, I'm just a solitary cowboy with a small cabin in the mountains. I can't offer you the kind of life you deserve." "What kind of life do you think I deserve, Gabriel Jennings?" she asked, a challenge in her voice. "One with a man who makes promises he never keeps? Or one with a man who builds shelter for a woman and child who aren't his responsibility, who stays up nights to make sure a premature baby keeps breathing?" Her words struck him silent. For so long, he'd defined himself by what he wasn't: not a family man, not someone who could be depended upon for more than a season. Yet somehow, without intention, he'd become exactly that for Abigail and Samuel. "I'm not asking for promises," Abigail continued when he didn't speak. "Just a chance to see if what's growing between us might take root, like that shelter you built." Gabe looked down at Samuel, so fragile yet so determined to live. Then at Abigail, her eyes clear and honest, asking not for grand declarations but simply for possibility. "I'd like that," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Very much." As winter settled fully over the mountains, their small household developed its own rhythm. Gabe expanded the cabin further, adding a proper kitchen area where Abigail could work more comfortably. Samuel grew stronger each day, his grip on Gabe's finger increasingly forceful, his cries more indignant when he was hungry or cold. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, Gabe often reading aloud from one of his few books while Abigail sewed or nursed Samuel. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing pieces of their pasts, discovering common ground in their love of open spaces and simple pleasures. One night, as a particularly fierce storm rattled the cabin windows, Abigail found Gabe standing over Samuel's cradle, watching the sleeping infant with an expression of such tenderness it made her heart ache. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. "That he deserves his father's name." The statement caught Abigail off guard. "Thomas abandoned us. He doesn't deserve any claim to Samuel." "I didn't mean Thomas," Gabe said, finally meeting her eyes. "I meant me." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. This wasn't just about staying until spring anymore. This was about something permanent, enduring. "Gabe," Abigail began, but he held up a hand. "Let me say this," he said, moving to stand before her. "I never thought I'd want a family. My own was broken enough to make me wary of trying. But then you came into my life, both of you, and suddenly, this cabin feels like a home instead of just a place to sleep." He took her hands in his. "I love you, Abigail. I love Samuel as if he were my own blood. And if you'll have me, I want to be a husband to you and a father to him in every way that matters." Tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks. "Are you certain this isn't the life you planned?" A rare, full smile transformed Gabe's face. "No, it's better. So much better than anything I could have planned." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, but filled with promise, like the first green shoots of spring emerging from winter ground. When they parted, Abigail's smile matched his own. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." With no preacher within miles, they created their own ceremony a week later. Standing before the fireplace, with Samuel sleeping peacefully in his cradle, they exchanged vows of loyalty, partnership, and love. Gabe placed his mother's simple silver ring, long carried in his pocket as a reminder of enduring commitment, on Abigail's finger. "With this ring, I pledge my life to you and Samuel," he said. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Abigail, wearing a dress she'd sewn from fabric Gabe had traded for with a passing trapper, took his weathered hands in hers. "I take you as my husband, Gabriel Jennings, and give you my heart freely, completely." They sealed their promises with a kiss, witnessed only by the crackling fire and the sleeping infant, a family created not by blood or law, but by choice and love. As winter slowly released its grip on the mountains, their bond grew stronger. Gabe taught Abigail how to track game, identify edible plants, and navigate by the stars. She showed him how to sew a straight seam, cook meals more complex than stew, and rock Samuel to sleep when he was fussy. Together, they planned for the future, expanding the cabin further, planting a garden when the ground thawed, perhaps adding a cow for fresh milk. One bright March morning, as they sat drinking coffee on the bench outside, watching the snow melt from the pine boughs, a movement on the distant trail caught Gabe's attention. Riders were approaching unusual in this remote area, especially so early in the season. "Stay here," he told Abigail, retrieving his rifle from inside before moving forward to meet the visitors. 3 men on horseback came into view, led by a figure Abigail recognized with a jolt of fear. Thomas. Somehow he had found his way back to these mountains to her. Gabe stood tall and unmoving as the riders approached, his rifle not raised but ready. "That's far enough," he called when they were within earshot. "State your business." Thomas Cassidy pulled his horse to a stop, his gaze moving past Gabe to Abigail, who now stood in the cabin doorway with Samuel in her arms. His face, once handsome to her eyes, now seemed merely cunning. "I've come for my wife," he announced, as if stating the obvious. "And my child, I see." Gabe's posture remained relaxed, but Abigail could see the tension in his shoulders. "You lost any claim to them when you abandoned them to die in a snowstorm." Thomas's companions shifted uncomfortably at this revelation. "Is that what she told you?" Thomas asked with a forced laugh. "We got separated in the storm. I've been searching for months." "That's a lie," Abigail called, stepping forward despite Gabe's warning glance. "You took everything and left me with nothing, Thomas. You said a baby would ruin your chances at the silver mines." Thomas's face hardened. "A man has rights to his wife and child. The law will side with me." "The law might have questions about a man who commits attempted murder," Gabe countered, his voice dangerously quiet. "Leaving a pregnant woman without supplies in a mountain snowstorm doesn't look like an accident to most judges I know." One of Thomas's companions, an older man with a graying beard, turned to him with a frown. "You didn't say nothing about abandoning no pregnant woman, Cassidy." "You said your wife was taken." "She's twisting things," Thomas insisted, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Look, I just want what's mine." "I'm not yours," Abigail stated firmly, moving to stand beside Gabe. "Not anymore. I've made a new life here, a better one." Thomas's eyes narrowed as he took in their stance, the protective way Gabe positioned himself slightly in front of Abigail and Samuel. "With him, this mountain hermit." "With my husband," Abigail corrected, her head held high. "Gabriel Jennings is Samuel's father in every way that matters." The older rider nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. "Cassidy, I think we're done here. This lady's made her choice clear." "You can't just—" Thomas began, but the third rider cut him off. "We ain't in the business of forcing women, Thomas. You said we was helping you find your lost family. Looks to me like they ain't lost at all." Thomas's face contorted with anger, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. Before he could draw, Gabe's rifle was up and steady, aimed directly at his chest. "Don't," Gabe said simply. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Thomas slowly raised his hands, the fight draining from him as he recognized defeat. "Fine, keep her, but this isn't over." The older rider shook his head. "It is over, son. Let's go." As they turned their horses, the older man looked back at Abigail and tipped his hat. "Madam, I apologize for the disturbance. He won't trouble you again." Abigail nodded in acknowledgement, her arms tightening around Samuel. Only when the riders had disappeared down the trail did she release the breath she'd been holding. Gabe lowered his rifle and turned to her, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though tears threatened. The confrontation had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. "What if he comes back?" Gabe wrapped his arms around her and Samuel, creating a protective circle. "Then we'll face him together. But I don't think he will. Men like Thomas are cowards at heart. Once challenged, they usually back down." That night, after Samuel was asleep, Abigail and Gabe sat before the fire, processing the day's events. "I was afraid," she confessed. "Not of Thomas exactly, but of having to choose in front of everyone. But when the moment came, there was no choice to make. You and this life we're building, that's what I want." Gabe took her hand, running his thumb over the silver ring. "When I built that first shelter for you, I never imagined I was actually building a future, our future." "Is that what we're doing now?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Building a future." He kissed the top of her head. "One day at a time." Spring arrived in earnest, turning the mountainside into a riot of wildflowers and fresh growth. True to their plans, Gabe and Abigail expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for themselves and another for Samuel as he grew. They fenced a small plot for a vegetable garden and built a pen for the milk cow Gabe traded for in truth or consequences. Word of their story spread through the scattered mountain communities and into the town below. Occasionally, travelers would appear at their door, seeking shelter for the night and bringing news and supplies to trade. Abigail's skill with a needle earned them additional income as she took in mending and sewing projects. Gabe's knowledge of the mountains made him valuable as a guide for hunting parties or prospectors. By Samuel's first birthday, celebrated with a small honey cake and a carved wooden horse Gabe had spent weeks perfecting, their homestead had transformed from a bachelor's simple cabin into a thriving family home. Samuel, strong and healthy despite his early arrival, took his first uncertain steps between his parents' outstretched hands, his delighted laughter filling the cabin. That night, after Samuel had been tucked into his bed, Abigail found Gabe sitting on the bench outside, gazing at the stars. She joined him, slipping naturally under his arm. "Happy?" he asked, a question that had become something of a ritual between them. "Very," she answered, resting her head against his chest. "Though I've been thinking we might need to expand again soon." He looked down at her quizzically. "The cabin's big enough for now, isn't it?" A slow smile spread across her face. "Not for 4, it won't be." It took a moment for her meaning to register. When it did, Gabe's expression transformed from confusion to wonder. "You're certain?" Abigail nodded, placing his hand against her still flat stomach. "The baby should arrive around Christmas." Gabe's laugh of pure joy echoed across the mountainside as he lifted her into a careful embrace. "I think," he said between kisses, "that we're going to need a bigger shelter." By the time winter returned to the mountains, the Jennings homestead had grown to include another bedroom and an expanded common area where the family could gather during the long, cold months. When Abigail went into labor on Christmas Eve, it was with none of the fear that had accompanied Samuel's birth. Gabe was at her side throughout, his presence steady and reassuring as he had been from the moment he'd found her in the snow. Their daughter, Anna, entered the world with a lusty cry that announced her arrival more effectively than any town crier. Unlike her brother's precarious beginning, Anna was robust and healthy, with a shock of dark hair that matched her father's. "She's perfect," Gabe whispered as he placed the newborn in Abigail's arms. "Just like her mother." Samuel, now an inquisitive toddler, peered at his sister with solemn curiosity from Gabe's lap. "Baby?" he asked, reaching out a careful finger to touch her cheek. "Yes, your baby sister," Abigail confirmed. "You'll help take care of her, won't you?" Samuel nodded with all the seriousness a 1-year-old could muster, making both parents smile. As snow fell gently outside their sturdy cabin, the family huddled together in warmth and contentment. Gabe, looking at the 3 people who had transformed his solitary existence, felt a fullness in his heart that once would have terrified him but now seemed the most natural thing in the world. "I never thanked you," Abigail said softly as the children dozed. "For what?" "For building that first shelter, foreseeing a future when all I could see was loss. Gabe kissed her gently. I think we built it together. 5 years passed, bringing changes both to the Jennings family and to the surrounding area. The town of Truth or Consequences grew as the railroad pushed westward, bringing new settlers and opportunities. Gabe and Abigail's homestead expanded to include a small herd of cattle, a flock of chickens, and a well-tended orchard. Samuel, now a sturdy 6-year-old, was his father's shadow, learning the ways of the mountains and developing the same quiet confidence. Anna, 5 and fiercely independent, displayed her mother's determination and her father's love of the wilderness. The family had grown again with the addition of 3-year-old Michael, whose arrival had been as straightforward as Samuel's had been complicated. Like his siblings, he thrived in the mountain air, already showing signs of becoming an accomplished horseman under Gabe's careful tutelage. On a warm summer evening, as they sat on the wide porch that now wrapped around their substantially enlarged cabin, Abigail watched her family with quiet contentment. Gabe was teaching Samuel and Anna to whittle, their small hands guided by his larger ones as they shaped pieces of pine into simple animals. Michael dozed in Abigail's lap, tired from a day of exploration. "Rider coming," Gabe noted, his eyes still sharp despite the years of family life. He set aside his whittling and stood, though without the wariness that had once accompanied unexpected visitors. The approaching horseman proved to be Jacob Miller, a friend who carried mail and news between the scattered homesteads. After dismounting and accepting a cup of coffee, he settled into a chair on the porch. "Brought your supplies from town," he said, "and some news you might find interesting." He pulled a folded newspaper from his saddlebag and handed it to Gabe. "Page 3. Gabe scanned the indicated page, his expression growing solemn. He passed the paper to Abigail, who read the small obituary notice. Thomas Cassidy, 35, died following injuries sustained in a mining accident in Silver City. "Thought you should know," Jacob said quietly. Abigail folded the paper slowly, surprised by the complexity of her feelings. The man who had abandoned her to die had himself died alone, his dreams of silver riches apparently unfulfilled. "Thank you for bringing this," she said to Jacob. After their friend had departed and the children were in bed, Abigail found Gabe standing on the edge of their property, looking out over the valley below, now dotted with the lights of distant homesteads. "Are you all right?" he asked as she joined him. She nodded, slipping her hand into his. "I feel sad for him, in a way. He never found what he was looking for. And you, did you find what you were looking for?" Abigail looked back at their home, the expanded cabin that had begun as a simple shelter, the gardens and corrals that represented years of shared labor, the warm light spilling from windows behind which their children slept peacefully. "I found more than I ever knew to look for," she answered truthfully. Gabe squeezed her hand. "So did I." They stood together as twilight deepened into night, the stars appearing one by one above the mountains that had both nearly claimed Abigail's life and given her a new one. The journey from that desperate day in the snow to this moment of quiet fulfillment had not been easy, but neither of them would have changed it. "We should head back," Gabe said eventually. "Early start tomorrow." Abigail nodded but held him back a moment longer. "I love you, Gabriel Jennings. Thank you for building a shelter for 2 that became a home for 5. His smile, no longer rare but still precious to her, warmed his eyes as he pulled her close. "Best thing I ever built," he murmured against her hair. "Best thing I ever will." Hand in hand, they walked back toward the lights of home, leaving behind the darkness and cold of a past long overcome, embracing instead the warmth and promise of the family they had created together in the shelter of the mountains. 10 years later, the Jennings homestead had grown into one of the most prosperous in the region. What had begun as a simple cabin was now a sprawling ranch house surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings, fertile fields, and healthy livestock. Samuel, 16 and nearly as tall as his father, managed much of the ranching operations with a maturity beyond his years. Anna, 15, combined her mother's skill with needle and thread with a head for figures, keeping the family's accounts with meticulous precision. Michael, 13, had developed into the family's horse expert, with a special talent for training even the most difficult animals. The family had expanded once more with the unexpected but joyous arrival of 8-year-old twins, Eliza and William, whose energy and curiosity kept Abigail and Gabe young at heart, despite the silver threading through their hair. On the 20th anniversary of the day Gabe had found Abigail in the snow, they gathered the entire family for a special dinner. The long table in the main room was laden with Abigail's finest cooking venison roast, fresh bread, vegetables from their garden, and an apple pie made from fruit grown in their own orchard. "Before we eat," Gabe said, standing at the head of the table, "I'd like to say something." He looked around at the faces of his children, each unique, each beloved, and finally at Abigail, whose beauty to him had only deepened with the passing years. 20 years ago today, I was hunting an elk and found something far more valuable. He reached for Abigail's hand. "Your mother was the bravest person I'd ever met, facing impossible odds with nothing but determination and hope. She taught me that sometimes what looks like the end of a trail is actually the beginning of a much better one." Samuel raised his glass. "To Mother, the bravest woman in New Mexico territory." "And to Father," Anna added, "who built a shelter that became our home." As the family toasted and began to eat, filled with the comfortable chatter of people who knew each other deeply and loved each other well, Abigail caught Gabe's eye across the table. No words were needed between them. 20 years of partnership had created a language of glances and small gestures that spoke volumes. Later that evening, after the children had retired and the house had settled into night sounds, Abigail and Gabe sat on the porch swing that had replaced the simple bench of their early days. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky, the same mountains that had nearly taken Abigail's life, but had instead given her a future she could never have imagined. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day?" she asked, her head resting against Gabe's shoulder. He was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her. "I try not to. The thought of you and Samuel out there alone." He shook his head. "I prefer to think it was always meant to be this way. That somehow, even before I knew you existed, I was building this life for us." Abigail smiled at the sentiment. "From a shelter for 2 to a home for 7. The best kind of expansion," Gabe agreed, kissing the top of her head, "though I'm still not sure how we ended up with twins." Abigail laughed softly. "Life's full of surprises." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds that had become the backdrop to their life together. The distant howl of a coyote, the soft nickering of horses in the stable, the creak of the swing beneath them, all pieces of the symphony that was their shared existence. "Happy?" Gabe asked, continuing their long-standing ritual. "Completely," Abigail answered, as she had countless times before. "You?" His response came without hesitation, as certain as the stars above them. "More than I ever dreamed possible." As they made their way back into the house, they had built together not just the physical structure, but the family and love that filled it. Abigail thought of the frightened, abandoned woman she had once been, certain her life was ending in the snow. How could she have known that what seemed like an ending was actually the beginning of the most beautiful journey. The shelter Gabe had built in those desperate days had been just the first step, the foundation upon which they had constructed not just a home, but a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone, carried forward through their children and the values they had instilled. From a moment of deepest despair had emerged a lifetime of joy, proof that even in the harshest wilderness, with faith and courage, the most unexpected blessings could take root and flourish.